Hi all. See the title above? So I'm asking about, was there a school in Tralee in County Kerry years ago? Let me just explain. I don't know much. What I've found on this topic is quite minimal. I've just come across little snippets of information over the last couple of years, and what I have said isn't very extensive, but I'll give you a taste of what I know. So I'm talking about what might not be a school, like a physical building full of deaf children in Tralee. But what I'm saying is, it looks like there was a class within a school in Tralee, within a school for hearing children, where deaf children were taught, and in sign language as well. And this would have happened between roughly 1865 and 1869, somewhere in that time frame. I'm not entirely sure of the exact start and end points when the school or class came to an end. But the first evidence that I have comes from 1865, and it goes on to around about 1869, so that's the time frame we're talking about. So, to business. The school I'm talking about was run by the Sisters of Mercy. This is an order of nuns. Maybe you already know that the Sisters of Mercy ran two deaf schools in Ireland. So, leaving the Tralee class aside for a second, there was a school in Cork that ran between 1858 to around about the year 1900. That's when that came to an end. And then after this period, there's a better known school in Westmeath in a town called Rochford Bridge, where a school opened in 1992 and ran until, well, generally people will say 1940 is the end date for that school, but I have actually found some evidence 4 years after that in a newspaper ad that it was still looking for and accepting deaf female pupils in 1944. So that's 4 years after it was meant to have come to an end. But anyway, so you had these two deaf schools ran by the Sisters of Mercy. Now those schools were only for deaf girls. There were schools for deaf girls. This school in Tralee that I'm talking about, run by the Sisters of Mercy, was a school for hearing girls, but there were deaf children being educated there. Let me just explain that now. So there were Sisters of Mercy. There was an order of the Sisters of Mercy from around 1854 in Tralee. They opened a new convent for themselves. The building actually was opened in 1861 in Tralee. And then sometime after the opening, around about 1868 or prior to 1868, a new orphanage came into being in the convent. So children that didn't have any parents were fed, clothed, looked after within this orphanage. But I was very interested to see a newspaper advertisement for the orphanage, which mentioned, this was an appeal basically for donations, that there was 4 deaf children in the orphanage. Also, this ad mentions 4 deaf mutes. Maybe there might be an assumption on your part that these were taught orally. But roughly around the same time in 1868, there were newspaper reports from events in Tralee. If there was something on in the town, some sort of special religious service or mass or different kind of things going on around the town where the convent was mentioned, the deaf children were also mentioned, plus their use of sign language. So for example, that they were signing prayers, or if there was song being sung, the children would sign what was being sung in sign language. Now, after 1869, we don't have any evidence, or at least I don't have any evidence. Maybe at that time there was a realization that the Cabra schools were there and there was an encouragement for deaf children to go to Dublin for their education. But at the time, Tralee was, it's obviously quite far from Dublin, and there was considerable cost involved in, horse-drawn carriage transport to and from Kerry and Dublin. So maybe it was considered more convenient to have a local school for deaf children there, and cheaper. But I found evidence from 1865, just before the evidence I've been talking about a particular deaf girl named Mary Foley. Mary Foley had already been sent to St. Mary's School in Cabra by this time. And she had been sent there by the Tralee Board of Guardians. And the Board of Guardians would have ran the local workhouse, they would have looked after poor people, and they would have sent deaf children who were poor to deaf schools. So 1862, the Board of Guardians had discussed this issue and agreed to pay for Mary Foley to go to St Mary's in Cabra in Dublin and be educated. So she was being educated in Dublin at the time. But in 1865, I came across a newspaper report which mentions that the Board of Guardians had discussed the issue again and decided to withdraw Mary from Cabra. So her education there was to cease and she would be transferred to the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Tralee. Now, it looks like the Board of Guardians needed permission first from their superior body, which was the Poor Law Commissioners. They would have been based in Dublin and would have monitored and administered all the boards of guardians across the country in Ireland at the time. So if you wanted to use your funding in a different way, you would have needed Poor Law Commission approval for this. So the Tralee Board of Guardians, it looks like they wanted to finish paying for Mary Foley's education in Cabra, bring her back to Tralee and begin paying the Sisters of Mercy in the convent in Tralee for her education instead. And so they asked permission for this from the Poor Law Commissioners. This was refused. The Poor Law Commissioners gave the excuse that the Sisters of Mercy school wasn't a recognised school, because at the time the Poor Law Commission had a list of recognised schools for deaf children all around the country. If you were recognised, if that was approved, you could then use that funding for that purpose. So St Mary's, St Joseph's, Claremont, at a later period then the school in Westmeath, Rochford Bridge, the Belfast School, were all on this list of approved schools that you could use Poor Law funding for. But the Sisters of Mercy School wasn't on this list. But the Board of Guardians really wanted to go ahead with their plan, so they wrote back to the Poor Law Commission and said, well, is it possible to get this school recognised? And then the Poor Law Commission responded again saying no, and the reason that they gave was because the Sisters of Mercy school was not solely for deaf children. If it had been an institution where only deaf girls were being educated, then maybe an inspector might have been sent down and they could have been registered, but not if it was a hearing school with only a few deaf girls being taught within it. The Poor Law Commission refused to allow Poor Law funds to be used for that purpose. The Tralee Board really wanted to go ahead with their plan though. They really wanted to put Mary Foley in the Sisters of Mercy Convent. And they again replied and said, well, the Sisters of Mercy Convent has a teacher that is solely dedicated to teaching the deaf girls in the convent. When I saw mention of this, I thought this was particularly interesting. The deaf children weren't being taught in amongst the hearing children so much as having their own teacher in the convent. This teacher was full-time working with them within the school. And the Board of Guardians really wanted the school to be recognised because they had a teacher of the deaf there. Now, they didn't use the phrase teacher of the deaf. It didn't have those connotations of being qualified. But there was a nun who obviously had received training before, maybe with Dominicans in Cabra, or maybe had been trained abroad, but certainly she would have had sign language and was teaching these deaf children. And on this basis, the Poor Law Commission were requested to approve the school, and again, they refused. It looks like they had their mind set on not approving the school for this purpose. So the Board of Guardians at this stage apparently let the matter drop. Mary Foley was left in Cabra. At the same time though, St Mary's in Cabra had written a letter to Tralee, to the Board of Guardians, requesting that Mary wasn't removed from Cabra. Now at the time, Mary would have started school in 1862. This issue came up in 1865, so she had already had 3 years of education and been in the midst of learning. So St Mary's worried that if she was withdrawn, her education would maybe be interrupted in a very damaging way, and so they requested that she be allowed stay in Cabra and in Dublin. But as I say, it looks like the Board of Guardians dropped the plan to withdraw Mary, and in the register for St Mary's, the pupils, it appears that Mary did complete her education and that she wasn't withdrawn. She was allowed to stay in Cabra until her education was complete. What's really funny is, around about the same time as all this is happening, So this is around about December of 1865. The Tralee Board are talking with the Poor Law Commission. They're going back and forth. The Board of Guardians want to withdraw Mary to put her with the Sisters of Mercy. But in the midst of this, there's another deaf boy called Patrick Foley, who had at this time been attending St. Joseph's in Cabra. So he finishes his education and comes back to the Tralee Union. And the master of the workhouse meets Patrick and reports back to the Board of Guardians that Patrick has been well educated, but it looks like the Board of Guardians didn't take much heed of this. They didn't particularly care, even though it was proof that the Cabra system was working for the deaf children. It looks like they still nevertheless really wanted Mary Foley to go into the Sisters of Mercy school in Tralee. And I think the reason for this, I'm pretty sure, was financial. Because every year they had already been paying the fees to Cabra. You're talking at the time it was about £15 a year, which was considerable at this stage, plus the transport fees, which again, given the distance between Tralee and Dublin, were really considerable. So maybe the Board of Guardians just felt it was handier and cheaper to have Mary educated locally. So that's really all the information I have. I've given you a taste of everything I have, really. But I know that there is there is a Sisters of Mercy archive in Baggot Street in Dublin. And I know that they do have a set of annals. So that's kind of like a historical record of everything that happened year on year in the convent in Tralee. Annals of the convent. I haven't seen that yet, so maybe you guys want to go and follow this up. Go ahead and visit this archive in Baggot Street. And maybe ask if you can visit, go in, have a look at the annals, and see if it says anything. Alright, so I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you.